Hey, welcome back to Morning Joe. Let's now bring in best-selling author and host of America on CRTV, Eric Bolling, and also MSNBC contributor, the author of How the Right Lost Its Mind, Charlie Sykes. Eric, let's start with you. You spoke with the president this weekend, and he told you that he was going to watch you on the show. He always watches the show. Hi, Donald. So we saw the president tragically have a phone that the all caps were locked, and he couldn't get it off of all caps. So he was writing in all caps this weekend. What was his state of mind when you spoke with him?
Amazing. And like I mentioned on Twitter, also mentioned to you, Joe, last night I'm watching Netflix, the last episode of Narcos, and the phone rings. It was unknown, which was unusual, and I usually don't answer those, but it happened to be, I said, hey, it's Eric, and the voice says, hey, Eric, it's your favorite president. I said, oh, President Trump, how are you? And we went into some of the things, and we spent a good part of 15 minutes or so talking about the things you've been talking about all morning, Joe. We talked about Russia. I happen to have an issue I wanted to talk to him about with the FCC and some of the things that are going on there. But we spent a lot of time, and I believe it came up unknown because he was on Air Force One going back to D.C. I will tell you, he was fine. He was in a good place. And again, this tweet that came out later with the all caps, think about this for 1 second. So he's being blamed by a lot of people, you know, I listened to the show all morning and the other networks for a failure at Helsinki with Putin. Meanwhile, the sanctions that he's placing on Russia are substantial. However, there's one very important point that no one's talking about. I mentioned this to him. When he leaned on OPEC to increase oil production, that damages Russia substantially. Russia's basically a one good economy, and oil is a massive part of that economy.
We only have so much time, and we want to get other guests in, and I've had the people ask you questions. So let me ask you, what about Russia? He's gone back and forth on whether he believes Vladimir Putin or whether he believes his own intelligence community. This weekend, he suggested that once again he believed Vladimir Putin, that Russia didn't interfere. Last week, he said a word was taken out of his script. From your conversations with the president, does he believe his intel community? Does he believe the CIA and Gina Haspel? Does he believe Dan Coates and the director of national intelligence that Russia tried to meddle in the 2016 election?
Well, so the conversations aren't specifically pointed towards individuals, but I will tell you he believes that whatever meddling that Russia has been doing, it's been going on a heck of a long time, Joe, and it wasn't unique to 2016. It's been going on forever. He also believes they didn't have any influence on the election.
The question, though, is, so, Eric, and again, because he goes back and forth, and by the way, I've always said that James Comey had a hell of a lot more impact on the election than Vladimir Putin, but that doesn't mean that all of our intel communities haven't said that Russia tried to meddle in and influence the election. So if the president didn't tell you that specifically, let me ask you, what do you believe? Do you believe the CIA and the director of national intelligence that Putin tried to meddle in our elections?
Of course. And Putin's probably tried to meddle in. And every other Russian leader going back 50 or 60 years, back to the Cold War, have probably meddled in all of our elections, and not only just the U.S., but other elections as well. I honestly believe Donald Trump, was treated poorly when he became President Trump by the FBI. This Peter Strzok stuff, look, it is massive when you have Hillary Clinton, the person, being investigated, and also Donald Trump, the campaign, being investigated by the same people, and there's so much bias going back and forth between the two.
And what's incredible is actually that there was only one investigation going on at the time that people went out and voted, and that was against the people around Donald Trump, and yet the FBI didn't tell anybody that. And again,
I totally agree with you, and I get that, but you have to look, you take a step back for 1 second and look what the people are saying. An NBC poll came out over the weekend showing Donald Trump at his highest approval rating in his whole presidency. So clearly, whatever the issues surrounding Putin and Russia are, the American people generally are less concerned about it than they are the economy or our safety.
Well, actually, Charlie, so that's a very good segue. The fact is that with the polling, Washington Post ABC News poll that came out showed that only 1 out of 3 Americans were comfortable with what Donald Trump did with Vladimir Putin, and only 29% support him attacking our intel communities. That said, among Republicans, among my former party, and I don't know if you're still a Republican, an overwhelming amount of Republicans don't mind Donald Trump taking the KGB's line on NATO.
Yeah, well, it's certainly an indication of how tribal our politics have become, whatever the polls say. The reality is that, you know, what we saw last week poses a real danger to the world order. Our allies no longer rely on us. Our enemies, I don't think, necessarily fear us. There's a lot of rationalization that is going on. You know, and that's why there's this moment where, okay, look, Republicans, I think, in private understand how serious this is, how unpredictable, how unhinged a lot of this behavior is, but they're not willing to say it in public. And I do think that there is sort of a, hey, you know, it's just Donald Trump, there's nothing to worry about. Look, if Donald Trump continues on this path, there is a very, very real danger. And, you know, it is so weird watching how America First has morphed into blame America First. You know, how the strong man, you know, turns out to be incredibly weak when he's confronted by a bigger bully. You know, and that's why I think, you know, that at some point, look, members of Congress are going to have to realize they're not just potted plants. The senators are incredibly powerful. No senator ever became great by being a lapdog. They're not simply ciphers. And there are things that they could actually do to reassert their constitutional authority without derailing the Republican agenda, without derailing the conservative agenda. And it's sort of time for members of the Senate to look around and say, you know, we're an important body here. You know, the Congress of the United States is a co-equal branch of government. We don't have to take, you know, our cue from Fox News hosts. You know, we don't have to cower and be afraid of the president's tweets. You know, I mean, man up at some point. And do what, Charlie? And do what? And change what? Okay, so the Senate steps up and says, a lot of we are. Oh, do what? So what would Charlie Sykes have the Senate body do differently than they're doing right now? And why? I mean, things are, the economy's popping. I haven't heard anyone mention ISIS other than a comedy skit in the better part of a year or a year and a half. I remember 2 years ago, journalist heads being beheaded. Do you want to hear the answer? Yeah, sure. No, I can answer. I mean, there's a lot of things. I mean, number one, you know, at the bare minimum, they could pass a resolution reaffirming support for our intelligence agencies and making it clear that Russia will be held accountable. No, Charlie, that's been going on for decades. They could you want to hear my answer? Do that? What a waste of time. They could also pass a resolution of censure of the president for his behavior with Vladimir Putin. They could pass legislation that would trigger sanctions if, in fact, the Russians continue to attack our election process. They could reassert their do you want to hear my answer? You asked me a question. They actually could pass legislation that would protect Bob Mueller from being fired. They could, in fact, you know, put some, and then, by the way, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee can hold hearings into our relationship with NATO. They could hold hearings into the threats that are being posed. You know, but on a tangible basis, the Congress could also go back and say, all right, you know, post-Watergate, members of Congress were able to pass very sweeping public integrity and ethics legislation, making it clear that no one in this country is above the rule of law. There are a lot of things that can be done. The history of the American Congress is rich with examples of members of Congress being willing to push back on the executive, and I think that people ought to take a page from that.
All right, that was quite an answer, and I agree with Charlie's answer, Eric Bolling, but I know that you'd want to have a response. We're up against the end of the show, but let's get you back tomorrow. Would love to continue this tomorrow if you guys could do that. And by the way, one thing, Charlie, that Eric agrees with you on is people don't need to get their news from Fox News anymore. They can get it from Eric. Is that right, Eric?
That's right.
When's your show on?
CRTV.com/Eric, and just go there. It's digital. It's there all the time. Live, 5 o'clock, a few days a week.
See, look at that, bringing people together. I'm a uniter, not a divider. Thank you so much for watching this morning, folks. We'll get those two guys back tomorrow, hopefully, and have more time. But right now, let's go to Stephanie Ruhle. She starts right now. Stephanie.
Thanks so much, Joe. Good morning, everyone.